Remember when you didn't worry? Remember when you didn't care? You want perfection, that's what you need. The only problem is that's not me. You don't think you can put up a random wall. I'm not your cutout paper doll. I want you to light me up like your cigarette, but instead you put me out. I want you to encourage me, but you fill me up with doubt. Girl, I know you wanna come on over, I won't tell. But I'm looking for a savior who will crucify me as well. You see, I try to stop, but you know I'm not an angel. Carousel of being tall. You want it all. You stumble, but you fall. Before you see it You don't know me till you see me cry. You don't own me, won't until the day that we die. You don't notice that I try for you, only you. It's only you, 'cause all I am is a blind rebellion. I won't hurt you, but I might hurt someone. Break you down till you're begging me to. One, two, three, shout. Take a drink of my drink, take a drag of my drag. Take a shot of the good and take a pill for the bad. Take your mama's advice so you can do what is right. Take a knife to the bed and take a gun to the fight. Everybody wants to see me down. Everybody wants. I want you to abuse me. Shut up and do me, 'cause everybody wants something from me. What's the point of screaming out if no one gives a damn? What's the point of reaching out if no one lends a hand? She had passed the point where there was nothing left to give. She was 17 and never ever learned to live. You wanna call me the devil's advocate, but you don't know the half of it. 'Cause I was raised to believe in miracles. My life is so I know that you can understand it. I'll not take a single, I know not